So without further ado, my name is Sudha Nandagopal. I'm CEO of Social Venture Partners International. I'm zooming into this summit from Seattle, Washington. And so glad to be with all of you today. Thank you all for joining us. So just to share a little bit about context for today's conversation, Social Venture Partners is a global movement of over 3,500 engaged donors, volunteers, and social change leaders. Together, we've invested more than $70 million in more than 900 nonprofits. We have affiliates in 40 cities and 7 countries. Our collective focuses on catalyzing more resources to solving major challenges of our time, demonstrating ways to disrupt philanthropy to create more proximity and accountability to those on the front lines, and influencing philanthropists to provide communities what they need most and to trust the wisdom that comes from those most impacted. Social Venture Partners International serves as the innovation and expansion hub for this global network. Most recently, we launched Reimagine Giving, an initiative to mobilize those with economic power who have benefited from our current systems to work alongside, learn with, amplify, and fund frontline efforts that are transforming communities around the globe. Today's panel brings together some leaders that I am super excited to learn alongside. These are all 3 folks who are working at the forefront of global issues. So today we'll be hearing from these leaders who are working with global movements and having cross-national impact. We'll discuss why it's critical for us to have a global viewpoint as we think about what we're trying to do, both as donors in terms of sharing our resources, but also in terms of how we share our time and talent and our energy. We'll discuss why it's not just about having a local viewpoint, but it has to be connected local to global, and how that can actually make all of our work stronger together. So I'm so glad today to have Jamila, Maria, and Tamara with us. And I'm going to actually let each of them introduce themselves. And so with that, I'm going to kick it to them. So with a question, and Jamila, I'd love for you to start us off. And the question I have for you after you introduce yourself is to share with our audience today, in this moment, what are you seeing as possibilities for donors? Why should anyone be thinking about global anything? Jamila, you want to take it from there?
Thank you so much, Sudha, and it's really great to be with all of you today for this important summit. So my name is Jamila Headley. I use she, her pronouns. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the places that I am local, because I'm local in a few places. I'm local where I was born and grew up in Barbados. I now live in Puerto Rico, San Juan, Puerto Rico. I'm local there. I'm local to New York City and to Oxford in the United Kingdom. And so in my own life, I have lived a life kind of that spanned across various places. I have worked in philanthropy, funding global social movements, working at the intersection of transparency and accountability in the health sector and on financing for health. I run a global health justice movement building organization that was working to transform what the world looks like in terms of access to treatment for people living with HIV, and also to mobilize a global response to emerging pandemics like the one we are facing now. Now I work as a chief of staff for the Center for Popular Democracy, an organization largely focused on the United States at transforming the world that as it exists in this country in terms of access to education, healthcare, a response to climate change, justice system reform, and many other issues here in the United States. So I found myself as a non-American working in the United States now and going from, and also having worked on global issues over time. And why anything global? I mean, I feel like the biggest example of why global right now is this pandemic that we're all in. We're on Zoom right now because of a global pandemic that has literally affected every single country across the globe, ground our global economy to a halt, essentially, in the early days, and completely transformed the way we all live, the way we all interact, the way we all do. And then on top of that has cost millions of lives already, and caused a whole set of people to fall into disability all over the world. And so we're grappling with this right now. And I guess why global? Because we exist in a world where we're all interconnected, but what is the possibility for donors in funding global work? I just want to talk about what I think is like a win. It's not everything, but it's a foothold that we gained yesterday when the US government came out to support a waiver, what we call a TRIPS waiver, to say that they would support a global agreement that would agree to not sue or pursue countries that break the patent for the COVID vaccines, allowing manufacturing of the COVID vaccines that we do have to be expanded around the globe. Now, just to give a context of this win, back in November, South Africa and India asked the world to do this. And we now see what's happening in India. Between then and now, it is global movements. It's people in South Africa, in India, 150 world leaders around the world in countries all over the globe, people in the United States. Just yesterday in DC, our folks at Center for Popular Democracy were in DC right before this announcement was made, protesting in support of this change. And this isn't everything. This is the US saying that they will not block, and they have been the biggest barrier in the past to some of this at the World Trade Organization. But it's just an example of what happens when there is real action that we all take to build the world that we all dream of, a world in which we all have access to something as basic and as fundamental and as life-saving as a COVID-19 vaccine. So that's a bit about me and why I'm here and why I'm really excited for this conversation today.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to dig in even further. Maria, can I ask you to indulge us with an answer to the same question and invite you to introduce yourself as well?
Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Maria Sjödin, and I moved from my home country of Sweden to Brooklyn, New York 7 years ago when I started working at Outright Action International, where I'm now the deputy director. And Outright's mission is to fight for the human rights of LGBTIQ people everywhere. We do that in country and at regional and international levels, including at the United Nations, where we're the only LGBTIQ organization working year-round with a focus on UN headquarters. And we also run the largest COVID emergency fund focused on LGBTIQ communities globally. And to answer the question about the opportunity, I think there's research from this group called the Global Philanthropy Project. And they have looked over a few years at the resources that go to LGBTIQ issues around the world. And the latest data is from 2017, 2018. And in those 2 years, the combined amount for LGBTIQ causes was 560 million US. And the thing is that more than half, about 300 of those 560 million go to the US and Canada. So that really shows that the rest of the world, which of course, in terms of, no matter how you look at it, is much, much larger. The world is much, much larger than the US and Canada. And the resources available, it's just so much smaller. And I see that as an enormous opportunity for donors to think globally. And if you think globally around LGBTIQ issues, you can have a big impact because you can be significant because the total amount and everything that is being funded is just such a small amount for the world. So that's what I see as the biggest opportunity and really an invitation for everyone to think globally.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I feel like we have to dig in on some of those numbers that you shared. But before we do that, Tamara, please share a little bit with the audience about who you are and what brings you here and why global, why now?
Hi, everybody. My name is Tamara Toles O'Laughlin, and I am a free-wheeling, free-roaming climate strategist, environmental advocate. I'm 41, so I've been at this about approximately half of my life. So before we called it climate, when it was environment and transportation and zoning and air quality and environmental health, all of those different evolutions, all trying to figure out whether or not we were moving towards environmental justice or away from environmental racism. I've held all of these spaces with real care around whether or not we're supporting communities at having access to people who can make decisions before our lives are risked, not after the fact and not as a photo op. So regardless of the hat I'm wearing and where I'm wearing it, that's usually what I'm looking for, is who's missing from the conversation. Are we bringing in equity, and have we readjusted our process to bring in people for whom it is the most difficult to be in this room? I am calling from Baltimore, which is Piscataway, Cherokee, and Lumbee territory, which is wildly important for the fight for recognition of communities, holding space for people so that we're not just talking about the work, we're doing it. And for me, it's really important to lift up that from the US perspective, I'm formerly the North America director of 350.org. If you participated in climate strikes, that was my very first job at 350, was to get 185 countries of folks out in the street at the same time, which means only 2 didn't participate. And so all things being equal, it's really important for us to recognize that there are no wins on climate. There is no domestic policy if it is not intimately tied to what the global responsibilities are and how we're holding them as folks who are polluters and folks who are holding space just to survive and keep it at 1.5. So all of that stuff has really shifted over that time to a global focus, from the US being much more insular and selfish and ignorant to a place where we recognize that we are a part of a much larger conversation. This new political calculus has really opened that up, because we have to re-enter the global conversation with not a lot of time to get anything done. So whether we're talking about fossil fuel non-proliferation or the movement for Black lives and the focus on people not being harmed because of their identity and kept from basic needs, we're just in a moment where we really need to be tender with each other to find our humanity and make sure people are brought into the conversation. So super excited to get into a discussion about where that shows up in climate and environment, how it informs the other ways we need to show up, and why the failures in one space just radiate out to other places where we fail to show up as human.
I love that. We have to be more tender with each other right now as we navigate these new waters. You know, I want to go back to something, Maria, you started talking about, and just as, you know, as Tamara was talking about the scene on climate, and Jamila shared about this big win around vaccine patents. I wonder if you can help us as an audience understand a little bit more about the global landscape of what's happening right now with LGBTQ rights, particularly as this pandemic has come into place and created more isolation in communities. Really curious to hear what the global landscape on human rights is looking like.
So I think that, I mean, I could talk about things getting worse, definitely in some places. We have just learned that Uganda, for example, that was quite a lot in the media a few years ago, they already have a law criminalizing same-sex relationship, but now they have added another provision criminalizing same-sex sexuality in their Sexual Offenses Act. So in some places, things are getting worse, and you can definitely see examples where governments in some places have used the pandemic as an excuse, framing LGBTIQ people as security threats, or just using sort of COVID regulations to crack down. Again, I'll use Uganda as an example, but there was a number of young people arrested in Uganda for breaking the COVID regulations because they were staying at a safe house because they weren't safe in their families. And the government claimed that there were too many people staying in one place. And of course, it's not a coincidence that they chose to crack down on a house that housed LGBTIQ people. Then there are, of course, many other places where things are actually gradually getting better. There's a lot more visibility everywhere around the world. So that is there. It's very mixed. Things are getting better and worse at the same time, depending on where you look. But what I can say around COVID and the pandemic, when a pandemic, it hits everyone, but people who live on the margins before the pandemic are going to be worse hit. People are overrepresented, LGBTIQ people are overrepresented in the informal sectors. Many people have to rely on their families in a time of crisis, but the family might not accept you. Our research has this quite sad example of one of the partners that we have been doing a lot of work with in the Caribbean, saying that their helpline that they set up to help people cope during COVID, one of their clients, this young gay guy, he literally had to, he had to go back to his parents and stay there. He literally had to call from the closet. Like he literally had to go into the closet and hide and speak very softly, hoping that his family members wouldn't hear him as he reached out for help. And we hear about that from all around the world. So yeah, that's a snapshot.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're bringing up is that the inequities obviously have been exacerbated in this moment, but it's also becoming really clear that being more isolated isn't the solution, right? We actually need to figure out how do we get more connected if we're going to increase equity around the globe. And, you know, I think a lot about the donors who I hear from who sometimes say, you know, they're living in other countries and they say, well, you know, I don't know, like last year, obviously many of us in the US were really focused on racial justice as, you know, the renewed reckoning and the protests erupted around Black Lives Matter last summer, and that's continued for many of us, right? And I think certainly for myself, I've looked at it as a moment where, okay, people are really paying attention to this thing, and I would love to hear, particularly, you know, Jamila, if you can share, kind of how are you seeing that from the other side, right? Not just from this is a US movement bursting forward, but also as we think about these things globally, what's the implication for sort of this emerging racial justice reckoning that's happening around the globe that, you know, that's situated here in the United States and certainly in our history, but can you give us a little more context? And then you know, Tamara, I'd invite you to share as well.
Yeah, I'm really happy to speak there. I've been reflecting on this a lot recently. We had a pretty remarkable summer last summer. Something pretty amazing happened at a time when we were all in the middle of a pandemic, at a time when we were all isolated and many of us didn't know what the future would look like. A horrible thing happened in the United States, in Minneapolis. A Black man on May 25th was murdered during a police arrest, and that sparked off, you know, that murder of George Floyd sparked protests across the United States. But the remarkable thing that I saw happen, and actually I like went back this morning and sort of did a count of the like kind of log of these, there were protests and actions in 86 countries in the month or two following that police murder. And it wasn't only because people were showing solidarity with folks in the US, with Black people in the US and what they were facing. It was because that was all too recognizable to people elsewhere. It was very recognizable. The treatment of Black and Brown people was a shared experience across many, many countries and many, many realities. And so you saw people in France take to the streets, in a country that has also been racked by its own kind of violence towards Black and Brown people. We saw people in the UK, we saw people in Kenya and in South Africa, and we saw people in Fiji and in my own island, Barbados, all take to the streets, calling for justice for Black people, calling for racial justice. I think there is something deeply resonant about that call, and something really transformational also about what people were asking for. It wasn't only an end to violence, it was how do we shift how we invest in communities, in Black and Brown communities? How do we shift how we engage on a whole host of issues, from the justice system to healthcare to climate justice, which climate change disproportionately affecting Black and brown people. And so you saw more and more sophisticated calls around policy change that linked up this racial justice agenda and like really weaves a global agenda. I think there's a huge moment of opportunity there that is like, that was just the tip of the iceberg, or the tip of what I think is possible if we show global solidarity around racial justice. And I think there's precedent for this. When you think back to the fight to end apartheid in South Africa, the role of people outside of that country in holding the government accountable, in ensuring that there were sanctions and there was consequence, ensuring global moral outrage at all sorts of levels was so important, and ensuring solidarity with activists in South Africa and funding for their important, dangerous and difficult work at that time was deeply important. And I think actually like that's the kind of solidarity that we need on racial justice fights in many places right now around the world. I think there's such incredible opportunity, and it's been inspiring to kind of see that groundswell of solidarity.
That's great. Appreciate that global perspective. Tamara, anything that you would want to add to that?
Sure. I'll just add that this isn't a new playing book. We've been at this work of civil rights, human rights, making sure that communities are seen, whether we're talking about climate reparations in the US or land and land damage, loss and damage in the UN context. We have always been about trying to figure out what is the civil society move in response to the demand of folks on the ground. I think what we have seen in this new grouping is a lot less focus on what separates us and more of what divides us. As we speak, the movement is planning to a global day of action around where all these pipelines are going. So just the idea that like a fossil fuel empire in one place equals a country being forced to remain as a set of petrostates. Like these are not separate and distinct conversations if there's only one planet that we live on. And so watching the uprisings bring to people a sense of humanity and a call to engagement is about us being open to seeing ourselves in problems that are unfolding, not waiting for an invitation and stepping in because the harm is great and we see it in our humanity. So I do think that this latest iteration is another set of unfortunate things happening, but with a better response from those of us who can do something. And there is encouragement in that. I think I look forward to not having so much for us to rally for and for us to raise so many dollars for and to get people's consciousness risen. But I do think that that there is some hope in this multi-generational work that's currently happening, whether that's marching or using digital power or dancing on TikTok. I mean, the children are surprising me. There are folks in mediums I didn't know exist fighting for things in communities they're not in. And so the dream is that we take up this work equitably, fighting for the work of others the way we fight for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like so much of this is about, what might start in one country but becomes global. Where are there places for us to learn, whether with the LGBTQ rights issues, it's not like the US has always been at the forefront, right? We have also looked to other countries to help guide our way. And similarly on the climate fight, right? There is an opportunity, I think, for us to be thinking about things really globally. And I want to bring it, because this is the We Give Summit, I want to talk for a moment and have each of you share a little bit about your thoughts on, why when we think about this, if folks see themselves as donors, right, as individual givers, what about that is particularly important and useful, frankly, to global movements? And yeah, I would love to hear from each of you on that. Maria, maybe if you want to start, and then we can ask others to chime in.
Sure. I mean, I think the act of solidarity is important. It's like we saw it. I'll come back to our COVID response fund again. And one of the examples, when we asked people to report back to us how had they used the money, and I can start by saying we launched it in April of last year, only a few weeks after the pandemic was declared. And at the end of April, after only 3 weeks, we had received 1,500 applications from over 100 countries. And at the end of 2020, we had distributed $1 million to 125 groups. And one of those groups was a group of trans people in Pakistan. And then they told us afterwards that this was the first time that they had received, it was the first time that they had received a grant, and they felt seen. So not only did they help provide food and support for their communities, but it validated them as human beings as well. Like they were being seen by other people. And I think that individual donors play such an important role in that. We would not have been successful with our COVID fund and the emergency fundraising if we hadn't actually received support from private foundations, from individuals, and from corporations. We are at the cusp of having we have one government. The government of Canada has contributed to the fund, and we have one more government on its way in. But that was in November. Like we started this in April. The people who moved first, who were on board first, and really showed us that we could do this, that we could have this fund, were individuals who have a much faster way of reaching decisions than a government, and who can respond because they feel moved. But I think it's important to understand for anyone who is a donor that the people who receive the support, they are also moved. They also feel seen and validated. So that's kind of a loop that I think of, that I think it's important for individual donors to see themselves in.
Tamara, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about one of my finest moments in my last role was being able to move a climate organization to focus on the work of racial equity. There's never time for that. It's never on the schedule. It's always inconvenient. And one of the most exciting things we're able to do was not just put out some of the great pieces that I've shared in the message here, but also to talk to our colleagues in the space about what they're doing and not doing, but most importantly, to talk to our base. Like we were a group of people and say, guess what, folks? This is about the time when we would send an email asking you to give us money. What we think you should be doing instead is donating to bail funds to get the folks who are putting their bodies on the line out of jail. And within 12 hours, a bunch of folks who mostly care about climate put $100,000 of their own money in $5 and $7 increments into a bail in 40 different states. We leveraged our channel to open up the floodgates for money that would otherwise just come to us to go to work where it's most needed. And so I do think I have been encouraged by the community's ability to recognize that we are showing up intersectionally. We're showing up in a lot of different identities at the same time. And if it is not us, it's our appendage, our family member, or a friend. And so if we're not doing this work with whatever we can, we put it together. I was come from a culture where your grandmother has a susu and you buy a house because everybody puts the money in together and you make those moves as a group. You don't make an individual decision without your community. It's the best thing we've ever built. So it's been really amazing to watch folks who have oriented themselves towards one kind of issue really take some time to think about, what does my silence mean? If I'm not putting $1 in or saying that I care about this thing or raising my voice, people assume I'm fine with the status quo. And so thinking about philanthropy and the use of the digital platforms, they're all ways to say, actually, I'm not comfortable with this. And the system actually is built to respond to not just a small number of people saying, I'm uncomfortable with this thing, can change the outcome for folks who have no other way of being supported. So among the things that I'm most proud of in that space, it was being able to leverage our channels, our place, and our privilege to really send dollars where they were needed so that children and the elderly and folks who just wanted to say this shouldn't go on anymore don't spend their time languishing in the system instead of fighting a good fight.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea that check writing, this donation becomes a stance, right? It becomes a moment of action. And also the call in that, I think, of making it public, right? And that's something that by being part of a giving circle, by being part of a community of donors who are alongside community leaders, you're not just quietly writing that check and sticking it aside. This is not about a private individual act. This is about a systemic collective move. And it means moving resources and then moving our energy. And so I'm loving what you're sharing there, and also how this is grounded in culture, right? It's not just about, this isn't some new thing. We've been doing this. We've been doing this kind of pooling together and coming together in so many ways, right? And so now we might title ourselves donors or philanthropists, but it's in many ways is core to civic engagement, right? Jamila, I want to make sure that I give you some chance to offer your reflections if you have to share on that question.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about this. You know, for any of us who work in the nonprofit space, and I've worked in in philanthropy before as well, you know, or in institutional philanthropy, we get funding from big philanthropic donors and organizations. Some of us get funding from government. That funding is really critical and plays important roles, but like there's some things that it's hard to do with that funding. Like sometimes it's hard to be really flexible. Sometimes it's hard to be ready and able to jump on a moment's notice to an important window of opportunity or an important urgent need that are facing our communities. And so over and over again, when we are in a place of like critical opportunity, of critical need, it is individual donors, it is people like us, like me and all of you on this call who are giving $5, $10, $2, $100, right? Like who are actually shifting massive amounts of resources to be able to change some of the injustices and address some of the injustices in our world. And like how, one that is so transformational. I just had my birthday 2 days ago, and I did a little bit of a fundraiser for a cause that I really care about. And the experience of all of these people pooling together to make something happen in my small community in Barbados was so powerful to me. So I think it's really important that your dollars are really, I think, special in the way that we can use them. And then the way that we can use them to build the power that we need to transform the systems. Like my own theory of change and all the work that I've done is working to build people's power, because I believe we're not going to get to climate justice. We're not going to get to racial justice. We're not going to get to LGBTQ rights and justice. We're not going to get to universal health care without real people's movement. And one of the ways that we show our commitment and that we actually fight in a way that we can win is by our feet on the ground. It's by showing up at those protests, signing those petitions, showing up at that visit to your elected official. But the other way we do it is by putting our money where our mouths are. And so when we see more and more people being able to give whatever they can for transformative change, I see that as building political power to win. And that's exactly what it translates in when you give to some of these causes, when you give to folks like Outright, when you give to folks doing climate justice work, when you give to folks like us who are doing work to transform the nature of governance and the democracy in the United States.
Thank you for that call to action, Jamila. I want to follow up on one of the threads that you started there. This, around your birthday, you got a group of people to give together, and we've talked about it here a little bit, this idea of pooled funding, right? And why is that particularly powerful in this moment of not just writing the solitary check, but if you can just share even a little bit more on that piece of coming together with others with your funding particularly.
Yeah, I couldn't afford to give, $7,000 to this really important cause in the memory of a friend that had recently died. I couldn't afford that. But, about 70 people got together and made it possible for me to give $7,000 to an important cause. I think what is true is there's power in numbers, and that we can all do what we can in a way that actually builds bigger power and is transformational. I think the other thing is something that's a little more psychic or spiritual or emotional that comes out of it. This beautiful act of seeing friends all over the world, from New Zealand and South Africa, people with different purchasing power, people that I knew couldn't give a lot, like the folks who said I can give $5 or I can give $10, right? Like coming together to do that in a time where there's a lot of challenge around me, and there's been a lot of loss, and there's been, I really felt a sense of like so much being possible. And part of what we need to win is also to stay motivated in the fight, in the fights that we're on, to stay encouraged in them, and to stay connected in a way that allows us to kind of open up our eyes and see what is happening elsewhere around the world. Like for me, the thing that brings me to the work is not winning, you know, health justice for this small, like this one community in the United States. It's winning health justice, you know, that means everyone, everywhere, in every country, right? And every opportunity to be connected to other fights in that way, I feel is like such a privilege and such an honor to be engaged in.
Yeah, I hear it as almost like so many of our communities feel segregated by class, and that this chance to pool resources around a common cause is actually a way that we can be in cross-class solidarity, that I can delegate some of my economic power to other people, and vice versa, right? That each of us, with whatever positional power we have, we are able to pool it with our resources, with our individual strength, but then we have this collective. So I love what you're painting there as a picture, Jamila. And I know oh my gosh, we're almost coming up on the close of this conversation. So before we move to the final set of questions, I would love Maria or Tamara, if you have anything to share about kind of this piece about pooled giving and pooling of funds, and why you're seeing that as really a critical opportunity as we do global work.
Yeah, I can start and say that I think we only ever make change with pooled money or pooled people, like people power or the power of money. And if we're able to leverage both, then we have an edge on folks who have taken what is the common good, all of our dollars, and used and weaponized it in a whole system to make sure that looking after your neighbors or your friends or your family or yourself becomes a political act. So I just wanted to lift up that by bundling our assets, by thinking about how we can move as a block, by harnessing the power of our dollars or whatever currency we are in, we are pinching the system. We're creating interventions every time we do it, whether that's getting into an election or supporting someone or showing the same way you show up at someone's home with food when they're going through a crisis. A crisis is not a singular event. But if your community shows up for you every single day with a meal at breakfast or a meal at lunch or a meal at dinner time, the period where you're in crisis feels like it's moving a little bit in real time, and you're able to move from one part of the crisis into a livable place or some stasis. And so in that same way, by pooling your assets with other folks, you create some ability for people to be in the situation that they are in, to move through it, knowing that they are not alone. So it is a vote of solidarity as much as it is the act of writing a check or putting some money in a basket. And communities have always thrived on those kinds of actions, on moving together as one and pooling our individual intentions and assets. So it feels like we're just continuing to do the work of people who have moved the needle in favor of the future against folks who are betting against us and have more assets than we do.
And Maria, I know you shared a little bit about your pooled fund, but if you want to add anything further, I'd love to hear it.
I mean, I think it can be particularly important also from the global perspective, because you can inspire other people when you come together. It can sometimes, I think, for donors be a little bit harder. It's like they are donating to people and to a cause that's happening in a place that they're never going to go, potentially. And so coming together, I think it's just not just, I mean, a part of it can be like you can help inspire other people. Maybe there's also an element of accountability. Like bringing your knowledge and your passion and your global thinking to other people who otherwise might not have gone there. And so that's a piece of the pooled funding that I think can be particularly powerful for the global issues.
Yeah, I love that idea of accountability, power sharing, power pooling, right? The transformation that each of you have shared. This is, I think, so powerful, right? It's important for us to see that local, global connectivity that we can make. One of the questions on a more personal level that I'd love to ask each of you is, in these times that have been so isolating, here we are on our separate boxes, connecting via Zoom. What is keeping you personally connected, inspired as you look across the globe and see what's happening around the world? And I'll ask Tamara to start us off there.
Sure. I'll say that it's less isolating. The community feels wider and it feels deeper. We talk a lot about in this work about solving problems at scale, but we also need to get to some depth. And it is difficult to do that without many other people. So in a time when we can say in every corner of the world that we want people to have access to vaccines, that matters a whole lot more than at a time when we might have had those sentiments in our homes and not had the ability to speak in so many different platforms and show up in lots of different places and make it difficult for the agenda of folks who want to move forward as though things are fine. We're saying, no, it isn't fine. And we see that it's not fine over there. And while I am not able to get to that place, I'm able to say, in this place, I see it and it matters to me. And so I do think that it is a bit of a witness. In the old days, we're able to keep the witness, we're able to expand the community and to make choices about who we want to be in relationship with. And so I have never had a situation in my personal or private or work life where I've fallen down and I asked whose hand it was that was helping me up. So I want to say that I think it's an opportunity for that hand to extend across many places that you may never go to hold up someone else who just needs a little bit of support. And so I think by underestimating that, we leave people alone when they can be with others. And I think we've saved a lot more lives showing up on these little boxes than we might have if we tried to wrestle all of this heaviness by ourselves. So happy to see that continuing on even in this discussion.
Jamila, what's keeping you inspired in this work globally?
Well, I mean, I think the movement for Black Lives, protests and actions last year really are one of the things. I was in Washington, D.C. helping to organize protests around Juneteenth as protests were erupting all over the world, and that continues to be inspiring, probably the largest social movement mobilization globally ever in history, being a part of that and knowing that so many people around the world were a part of that was incredibly inspiring. But there are other things too on a smaller level. I sort of live this life where I am connected to people all over the world. My family is scattered across continents, and we haven't in the last year been able to be together and gather together as we usually would, and same with many friends and comrades. And so I find myself actually more tethered, more following the news, more listening and talking to people around the world in this time where we are further apart, and feeling even more strong in my identity as someone who is stretched across geography. By nature, by who I am, and so I feel like there's a personal thing that's keeping me inspired and fired up. You know, I'm worried about friends and loved ones in India right now. I'm worried about folks in South Africa. I'm constantly engaged in worrying about my family in Barbados and in Europe, right? Like where things are really concerning too. And so I'm feeling really continually fired up and inspired by both those things.
Maria, if you want to share a little personal.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have sometimes been accused of being a workaholic, and I'm sure that may resonate with many people here. But I must say that in the last year, my work has really been exceptionally meaningful. Like, connecting with so many people and really working for an organization that was able to so quickly pivot. And it's not that we can skip the long-term work. I mean, speaking of pandemics, I mean, racism, homophobia, transphobia, they're all pandemics. And the long-term work needs to continue. But being able to both research and respond with the fund has been exceptionally meaningful and has afforded a lot of connections. So when I had friends who were like exchanging lists of shows to watch on Netflix, I was trying to figure out like, okay, can I add a couple of work hours in the evening? And it's been exceptionally meaningful and really has given me an additional sense of purpose. And I think that has meant a lot to me personally, and I think it really has also helped me cope with the situation. So yeah, I think that's how I feel about it.
Well, I feel like today's conversation has been so rich. So thank you for your generosity and sharing. You know, I heard about how philanthropy and solidarity are not one directional, right? It's not just about the US and folks in the Americas trying to do something on behalf of others. It's truly global, that we can learn together as movements, that what happens internationally affects folks here in the US, what happens in the US affects folks around the globe. And so how are we really thinking globally? The opportunity for us to be coming together to share our power, to delegate our economic power by pooling our funds, and actually to be more nimble, be more responsive than oftentimes governments can be internationally and around the globe. And so, there's a lot here that I'm taking as takeaways. As we close, I'd love each of you just to take, a few seconds, 30 seconds to share for our audience, what is your global vision as we transform our world? What is the power of movements and donors in that vision? And really anything that you want to offer as closing reflections. So I'll ask Jamila to start us off with just a little bit of closing reflection, and then our final two panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Sudha, for that really important question. Wow, I mean, it's a big question, and I'll just take a small slice of it. Like, I dream of a world where we all have access to like quality healthcare, no matter where we live, and where it is healthcare that keeps us from getting sick, and that when we are critically ill, that we know that we are covered, no matter where people are in the world. And I think we will only get to that world because of movements, because the barriers in the way of doing that, whether it be, government financing and what government budgets look like, whether it be how pharmaceutical companies set the price of medicines, or whether it be how the private health insurance industry is run, they are all things that are deeply steeped in entrenched power that needs to be challenged and shifted. And I think the only way that we get to shifting those is through movements, it's through global solidarity, it's through people demanding change and taking action for change and putting their money where their mouths are to make it happen. And I truly believe, years ago, we never thought that it would be possible to even be talking about universal healthcare, single-payer healthcare in the United States. And yet we had an election just now where we had several candidates like jockeying for who has the best, universal healthcare plan on the Democratic ticket. We're seeing major movements, and it is because of the investment in people power building and movements. And so I have this vision, and I truly, truly think that it is possible. As crazy as it seems, as far away as our countries are from that, I truly believe it is possible, and I'm organizing to win.
I so hope you get everything, that we get everything that you wish for, Jamila. I mean, I think from the LGBTIQ perspective, it's like movements literally is what's changing the world. It's like our visibility and our existence, and the idea that no politician should be able to say, oh, it doesn't belong here in our country. This is un-African. It doesn't belong here in whatever country. Like we've heard it so many times. We've heard politicians and the leaders saying, well, we don't have any of those here, wherever here is. I heard it in Sweden. I heard it from, I mean, I've heard it from everywhere, but it's not true. We are everywhere. And the fact that we are coming together to organize ourselves around the world and connecting through from the grassroots in the local town, wherever, and connecting to a global movement, I think that is part of what's creating change. And no one's going to hand it to us. We have to demand it. And of course, I think that, I mean, I don't know, I don't think it's necessarily going to happen in my lifetime that everyone everywhere is free to live their life regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But we're getting closer, and it is gradually we'll be able to make it happen. So yeah, that's what's keep me going. So.
What keeps me going is knowing that I'm not in it alone. Over the last few years, there have been plenty of occasions to ask, could this get any worse? I think we've all had that feeling in some moment or another. And what I've thought is, no, I woke up in this body in these times and I've been in it my entire life. What is now happening is that there are more of us. So maybe we can form a human chain and get out of this ditch. So I have lots of hope that that as our humanity is exposed, the word apocalypse actually means unsheathing, unveiling. So as much as we talk about that word in the context of catastrophe, it's also about what is revealed in the moment where we are in crisis. And what I've seen over and over again is that we are human and we are better than the sum of our parts, but only if we work together. So super glad to have this time together to reflect on some of what we've won ever so slowly and how we can keep doing that.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us.